The Holcim Foundation Awards is proud to partner with The Urbanist on Monocle Radio. The Holcim Foundation Awards is the world's premier competition for sustainable design, highlighting projects that contribute to the transformation of the building sector. Awarding $1 million in prizes, it honours excellence in sustainable design and construction. By showcasing innovative, soon-to-be-realised projects, the awards drive change and inspire a new generation to adopt responsible design practices. Entry for the next awards competition is open now. Find out more, get involved and submit your free entry. Go to holcimfoundation.org/awards. The Holcim Foundation Awards, proud partner of The Urbanist on Monocle Radio.
Hello and welcome to The Urbanist, Monocle's program all about the built environment. I'm your host, Carlota, Rebelo. Coming up.
Well, what's very clear is that the challenges of climate, the challenges of affordability are here now. So it's essential that we have the capacities in our cities to manage these challenges.
We're in San Francisco this week as we report from the 4th annual World Economic Forum's Urban Transformation Summit. Loved for its hilly landscapes and the iconic Golden Gate Bridge, paired with a certain infamy due to high levels of homelessness, San Francisco has become a hotspot in recent years for urban renewal, attracting investment to regenerate its downtown center and development of its waterfront. So join us as we explore how the city is preparing for the future and what lessons are there from both the private sector and other regions to take back home with us. That's all coming up over the next 30 minutes right here on The Urbanist with me, Carlota Rebelo. Cities are at the epicenter of innovation and progress. So, as the world moves to increase urbanization, it is crucial to build cities which are resilient, equitable, and that can deliver a better quality of life for all. This, among other themes, was at the center of the World Economic Forum's Urban Transformation Summit, which gathered over 200 attendees from both the public and private sectors to debate what the future of urban living looks like and what lessons are there to be learned from each other. One of those in attendance was Lauren Sorkin-Yo, who's the executive director of the Resilient Cities Network. She told me more about the power of the network and where it all started.
100 Resilient Cities was about the why of resilience. It was about creating the theory, the frameworks, and the initial practices. After 6 years of really successful implementation with cities, creating strategies and creating a network of over 100 resilience professionals around the world, Resilient Cities Network is the next generation. It's about the how. So we are an organization that organizes the 100+ cities now from resilient cities around the world in over 40 countries to actually work together to deliver resilient solutions in energy, in water, in heat management, in circularity, and very much about economic opportunity.
Now, we've seen over the past couple of years a rise in positions such as chief heat officers around the world, chief resilience officers as well. Do you feel that there's a better understanding by the general public about the need to implement sustainable, equitable and resilient practices in our cities? Or is that still a conversation that's very much happening within, the practitioner circles? Because making sure the message gets across can sometimes be a bit tricky.
Well, what's very clear is that the challenges of climate, the challenges of affordability are here now. So it's essential that we have the capacities in our cities to manage these challenges. The role of chief resilience officers and many times chief heat officers is to come in and to manage those issues. So there is a lot more awareness that this is needed.
Now, what's interesting as well is how, even though a lot of the challenges can be shared and there's a lot to be learned about this shared knowledge between cities, the solutions differ because what works in one place won't work in another for a variety of reasons. But is there kind of like a resilience toolkit that are like the very basics that cities need to implement?
There are resilience tools and frameworks that help cities to organize themselves, to ask the right questions, and then to come up with the right solutions that work locally. I think the most important principle when you think about resilience is to really look at your entire city as a system. It's a system that you need to organize in terms of both shocks and stresses, and then look at how you can create single solutions that deliver multiple benefits. We at Resilient Cities provide cities with training, with tools, and also with peer-to-peer support so that they can take those principles and develop them into solutions that work locally.
Now, I want to go back to a point you mentioned earlier when you were describing the work of the network. And you mentioned and stressed that this is also about, economic resilience, because it's perhaps misleading that people immediately go to climate mitigation. But economic resilience is becoming more and more important, particularly as the world faces a housing crisis, a rise of the cost of living. What are some of the approaches here that you think are worth noting?
I think it's important for cities to understand their risk holistically, right? If you're thinking about it as if a city were a person, right? You'd want to know what is going to be affecting you in the long term, and then you'd want to set aside the right resources to respond. I think that's really the key here, is understanding the risk and having the resources, financial, but also the capacities to know how to respond and where to make the right investments so that you will not be caught off guard.
Now, the topic of resilience is not unknown to San Franciscans. After all, they live in a city with high seismic activity. But efforts are now being made to address another of its climate-driven challenges, the rise of the water level. That's where the Port of San Francisco comes in. With 7.5 miles of waterfront under its purview, the agency launched the Waterfront Resilience Program to adapt the city's landscape to the effects of climate change. Brad Benson is the director of the program, and he started by explaining how the city has always had a deep connection with the water.
It took 40 years for the city to build a seawall to really become the great West Coast port that it became. From approximately the early 1900s, just before the opening of the Panama Canal, up through about the 1950s. So today, we're dealing with that waterfront. It was built at a certain elevation that was necessary to support maritime activity at the time. And we're seeing two things. One, that it was not engineered to survive major earthquakes. And two, that current elevation is too low to deal with sea level rise. The city has developed the waterfront in such a way where we have major infrastructure and transportation systems right on the city's edge. So the city has a combined sewer system that is in the Embarcadero, right near where we stand today. We also have light rail facilities running up and down the waterfront. And I think we made an early decision in our planning for sea level rise that we wanted to maintain that connection to the bay. So in some other communities, we've seen proposals for walls at the shoreline that tend to divide communities from their waterfront experience. We made a decision here that we wanted to gain elevation slowly to a higher shoreline so that we can maintain universal access to the bay. And I think that helped us a lot with sort of public reaction to a plan that's going to be very impactful to the waterfront. Second, thinking about historic resources, the Port of San Francisco has two National Register historic districts on port property. One is the Embarcadero Historic District, which consists of the historic piers and the ferry building. Beautiful architecture that defines the waterfront experience. And then the Union Iron Works Historic District at Pier 70. And in all of our adaptation planning, we've been very mindful about this role of stewarding historic resources. So with the help of the Army Corps of Engineers, we're consulting with the State Historic Preservation Officer and historic preservation experts in the city. And what the plan is doing is it's going to elevate historic resources that intersect the shoreline to that higher shoreline elevation. So we're actually talking about raising the ferry building 6 to 8 feet from its current elevation as part of these future adaptation plans.
Now, the study is in its final stages. The next step is to get approval from Congress.
Yes.
How much have other cities inspired this work, and how much of a case study is this program becoming for global partners?
So we rely on all of the cities around the country that have done this work before us. Many have been impacted by disasters, hurricane disasters on the East Coast and the Gulf Coast. They have a rich history of working with the Army Corps of Engineers, and we learn from them all the time. We actually made a study trip up to Seattle to learn how they rebuilt their seawall and incorporated nature-based features in it. And so I think it's critical in this type of planning work, which is new, right? Most cities, they're thinking about housing development. They're thinking about transportation development. Here, you're talking about actually raising the grade of your shoreline and changing the way your city functions. And it's a new type of planning, and you really have to rely on others who've been down the path to exchange ideas. And we're lucky now to have been in a position working with the Corps where we have something to share as well.
But urban resilience is not just about tackling risks posed by climate. It's also about a city's ability to adapt and grow despite any stress factors. In South Africa, this is manifesting itself in the country's bid to deliver adequate housing for all, as Mameluko Kubai, South Africa's Minister of Human Settlements, explained.
Coming from a country that has a history of spatial disparities, but with huge backlog in terms of just affordable and ensuring that people have a shelter. Our constitution as South Africa puts an obligation on government to ensure that everybody has a shelter. So we've got to put policies in place that needed to be looked into and ensure that people can have a shelter. But we've got quite a lot of informality as well that one had to look into and respond to the challenge. So I was appointed in 2021 and reappointed now after the elections 2024. It has been something that I look for, but it has been quite fascinating as well. Daunting task, but also fascinating, because when you see the results of having provided a shelter to a senior citizen, the most vulnerable person, and we do, it's quite fulfilling because you'd have made changes into somebody's life.
Let's turn then to some of the issues that were discussed earlier this morning, particularly when it comes to sustainability, resilience, and climate action. As more and more people move to urbanized areas, it becomes so important that new buildings are built right, and with this in mind, paint me the landscape in South Africa for these particular issues.
Sustainability and resilience is important. That's why one of the things that we have done as South Africa, we championed the Global Action Plan in eradicating informal dwelling and slums, which was then adopted by the UN Habitat as a global action plan for the world to be able to implement. We do this deliberately because we understood that the climate change and disasters as they happen, they affect more vulnerable people whom we find in the slum areas, in the informal dwellings, because the quality of where they're staying is not, of the shelters is not adequate, and therefore they become most vulnerable. And that's why one of the things that we had to champion. So part of what we do now is to be able to implement that. We've got what we call informal settlement upgrading program, where we move into the informal settlements where people have put themselves in informality, and therefore we start upgrading, putting bulk infrastructure and therefore top structures. But we're looking at inner cities as well, repurposing of old buildings, which were offices, for residential purposes. That has been received with mixed feeling. People who come because of cultural background would want a yard because they've got to do cultural practices, religious purposes. So it's also around transitioning and transforming. That's why the conference now is important, because you've got to transform communities and families to understand that living in an inner city and urban area, it's different living in a rural area where there's land availability and all that. But again, dealing with the issue of changing the way we build. South Africa over time has been using brick and mortar to build. One of the issues that we had to do in policy change is to allow for alternative and innovative building technologies. We've got a center that is an innovation center for alternative building. We are doing regulatory environment for people to be able to, those who are entrepreneurs, to bring alternative building technologies, but also calling for private sector to build. It's still at the early phases. From a policy point of view, we think we've covered the areas, but the reception type of it, because when people see in our culture, in our environment, building with wood is not common. So people are a bit wary about it. So it's going to take some time to have people accepting such alternative building technologies. But what we are trying to do is that let's reduce carbon emission, for example, in the cement that we use, so that it becomes a gradual phase. And one of the areas that we decided, because we implement emergency housing after a disaster, is to say we're going to enforce in terms of building with alternative technology so that people can see that it's resilient, is sustainable, but also it's friendly to the environment and therefore can be utilized, and there's nothing inferior about that property. So those are some of the things initiatives that we're driving.
Well, we know that change always takes sometimes a few generations to be fully accepted. It always comes with a bit of friction, even when it's the right way forward. Just finally, we mentioned earlier, the global urban agenda, being associated with the United Nations. You're here at the World Economic Forum's Urban Transformation Summit. Why are gatherings like this so valuable to you and to these issues you've been discussing, and what would make your participation here a success?
The platforms here are quite important because these are influential platforms that informs policies globally and informs multilateral discussions. You'd see quite a number of issues have emanated from these discussions into broader WEF, into UN platforms, and that's why it's important, both in terms of listening to what others are doing. We've listened to some of the cities presenting how they're partnering with private sector. We've listened to private sector because what WEF does as well, unique to many of the organization, it brings private sector in. So when you're looking for public-private partnership, this is one of the critical platforms to be able to do such platforms. I've participated in WEF over years, and each time we've been able to make significant progress, either in terms of partnership or collaboration, but networking as well. But influence as well what becomes policy globally, and that's important because if we do not participate here, for example, as the global south and African continent, majority of the time we're missing in these conversations, and therefore they become for the developed countries, and they do not take cognizance of what is happening on the grassroots in terms of developing countries and the African continent. So my participation here is always to ensure that the voice of African continent remains present in critical discussions, but also what we can leverage out of this back home. We always say as South Africa, when we participate in these global platforms, it's not for us, but it's for the continent, and that's what we have been doing.
Now, one of the remarkable things about this summit is WEF's ability to gather players from all sectors and from cities of all sizes. There's no such thing as being too small, and in fact, it's often the smaller cities which can teach a lesson or two to the big players. Kimberly Norton is the mayor of Rochester in Minnesota, a city with just over 120,000 inhabitants. With a long history of public service, Mayor Norton puts community engagement at the center of her work and credits that as the success factor in her city's urban renewal efforts.
I started out my career in Rochester as a community volunteer, got heavily involved in school issues primarily, and helped actually get people elected to office. And it was through that time where I thought, I'm helping other people get elected. Why don't I just do it myself? So I did. And so I've served on our school board in the state legislature for 10 years following that. Primarily, I was a generalist, I would say, but I went to get funding for schools. It was that important to me. And now have been serving as mayor for the past 6 years. And it was through really all those roles, representing the voice of the people in my community, having to learn to know what they wanted, to talk with them and know where the gaps are and what our needs were. That has really benefited me as someone who's been in public office, but now as mayor, as we transform our city, where are those voices as we change and grow as a community?
Well, you talked about transformation there, and that is precisely what's been happening in Rochester, this commitment to bringing innovation and technology and transforming it as a medical destination as well. Tell us about those projects and how it gives back to the local community.
The transformation has been fast and furious. We are one of the United States' growing economic centers with 5.9% worker growth this last year. It's been an amazing experience. Part of that has been involving community voices in it, for certain, but also looking at opportunities. And we were given the opportunity of $585 million from the state of Minnesota in some legislation called the Destination Medical Center. And it is through that initiative that has allowed us to say, what do we need to do to change our community, the infrastructure of our community, to be ready for what's next in growth and development. And so that's what we've been focusing on for the past nearly 10 years now as a community, and the growth is now happening. Mayo Clinic's had an announcement of a $5 billion investment, which is just mind-blowing, the largest in the state of Minnesota's history, that will be in our community over the next 5 to 7 years. And so what are we as a city, what am I doing as mayor to help our city be prepared for that unknown future and trying to get their voice at the table as we do so.
You also were the recipient of a $1 million grant by Bloomberg Philanthropies. Tell us about that and what you are hoping those funds can help achieve as part of this ongoing transformation of the city.
Absolutely. One of the things through Bloomberg Philanthropies, we've had a number of opportunities participating in the Data Alliance and What Works Cities, and really setting that as a goal for our community to use data, helped us learn that while we have a pretty strong average median income, while we have a poverty rate that is significantly lower than the rest of the country by several percentage points, that data showed us that our Black population, while we only have a 7% poverty rate, 40% of our Black population is living in poverty in our community. It was mind-boggling to really look at true data and say, what are we going to do? So we focused our grant application on what's happening in our city. Of course, it's a growing community. There's going to be a lot of construction, not only because we're just growing as a city, but because of Mayo Clinic and, frankly, the IRA, the Federal Inflation Reduction Act. There's a lot of opportunity, but we have less than 1 or 2% women and women of color in particular in the built environment careers. So our grant, which we were thrilled to be able to be one in the whole 3 in the United States and 10 or 15 worldwide, to be able to take this $1 million opportunity to invest in systems changes so that people in our community moving forward, people of color, women of color in particular, are able to take advantage of our growth. And so we're implementing it right now, and system change takes time. You want to snap your fingers and say everything's better because we got this $1 million, and it will be, but it's going to be a sustained effort moving forward.
Also, just finally, one of the issues that kind of comes up in every single conversation we've been having here throughout the summit is, the need to address sustainability, address climate change, be ready for resilient strategies. How's that conversation taking shape in Rochester, and how do you see the city evolve to tackle urban growth with resilience in mind?
Yeah, I would say this has been an interesting challenge the last few years. I was involved in a University of Minnesota exchange to Germany. We have a sister city for climate, Munster, Germany, that we work with. Through that relationship, it really pushed us to do something. You can't keep learning, you can't travel, you can't hear these great ideas and not act on them. And so the city of Rochester has just dug 2 geothermal wells and have put our city hall on geothermal energy, and we are transforming that into an entire district of city buildings and then into the private sector. And we have some developers, which is really exciting, saying we want to hook up to that network, so let's get that done. So we are moving ahead, trying to create the cities of the future to address climate change. And I'm really pleased to say that our public utility, we have a city-owned public utility, they committed to being clean energy 100% by 2030 when our contract is up with our supplier. So we are on a fast track to be 100% renewable, to reduce our carbon, and be a city that people can look to.
But we couldn't talk about urban innovation without turning to the private sector. The collaboration between these entities, local authorities, community groups, among others, is crucial for harnessing the expertise needed to address all the challenges we've heard so far. Kwesi Mitchell is the Chief Sustainability Officer for Deloitte, and he told me more about the role that private sector can have in helping to deliver resilient and sustainable solutions, and also the importance of taking global lessons and adapting it to the local context.
I'm responsible for organizing our global commitment, specifically around our path to net zero, which we recently had SBTI validated for 2040.
Now, we just came off a discussion about, the need to accelerate urban innovation. And one of the themes we kept going back to was the need of communicating with the different parties, of engaging all the different stakeholders. Tell me about your experience on this and how are you bringing these partners together?
Yeah, there's two distinct ways that we think about engagement. First and foremost is how do we engage our 400,000+ employees around the globe, specifically around sustainability. So decisions that they make on a daily basis, from how they commute to how they consume, and even their core behaviors that could have a positive impact on the environment. And you think about mobilizing over 400,000 people in a common direction, you truly can have a meaningful impact. The other thing that we think about from an engagement standpoint is efforts such as what we've been discussing over the last few days of Yes San Francisco, where we are involved in a coalition focused on bringing sustainable solutions to downtown San Francisco in collaboration with the World Economic Forum, the Salesforce, the Chamber of Commerce of San Francisco, and lastly, Citi, along with 20 other organizations as well.
Obviously, you're coming from the perspective of the private sector, but that engagement and that relationship with cities and local authorities is crucial for, a successful environment. What are some of the examples that come to mind of collaborations that you have done, great case studies that our audience should know about?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because you think about the Sustainable Development Goals, and all of them are just so phenomenally complex in and of themselves that they require a coalition, which is why I go back again to our efforts with respect to Yes San Francisco, where to mobilize people specifically on bringing sustainable solutions that are going to create jobs and also bring items to bring more green spaces or sustainable solutions to buildings within San Francisco truly does take a coalition of over 20 people or 20 different organizations that build off of local plans such as the City of San Francisco's Climate Action Plan as well. So anything that I view fundamentally that are going to be truly transformational that impact the Sustainable Development Goals has to be done as a coalition overall.
Now, you had an amazing quote earlier today in our session where you said that sustainability is no longer an option. And while everyone agreed with that, I'm curious to hear if, while it's not an option, do you still have to explain why it's not an option?
Oh, absolutely. We're still doing things such as explaining why it's not an option. And also it's just because of the different angles and ways that people approach sustainability. I fundamentally believe that we need to be thinking about a just transition. We need to explain why just transition is important, particularly for people whose viewpoints aren't really centered in that particular area. We also need to be incredibly thoughtful on how we discuss sustainability in a apolitical fashion. I don't know anyone who isn't for nature. I have yet to meet that specific person. So as long as we can find that common terminology to have us focus on a common goal rather than politics, I think it puts us in a really good path for moving forward. And we're just going to have to explain things for people for a little bit longer.
Now, we are here at the World Economic Forum's Urban Transformation Summit, a global gathering, people from all over the world. And summits and events like this are frequent amongst practitioners, but a lot of the times there is then a problem of taking these global solutions and these global anchor points back to your community in a way that is relatable to them. How do you go about doing this, and how do you balance the global versus local needs?
I think that local needs will always triumph. Just fundamentally, it's where we live, it's what we love, it provides so much for us, which is why in collaboration with the World Economic Forum, we use their platform Uplink to run the YesSF Challenge. And it's the first location-based challenge that has ever been used or ever been run on the Uplink platform. And so you think about that, and what we wanted to do is bring a variety of perspectives and opinions around the world to a local specific challenges to bring the best and brightest thinking, and that I think is a great way to bridge both global innovation and bringing it down to local solutions.
So there you have it. With urban areas now home to 55% of the global population, a figure expected to rise to nearly 70% by 2050, it has never been more urgent to build better and in more resilient ways. And if there's one thing that became clear at this year's Urban Transformation Summit, is that there are a lot of people working hard to deliver a better world and ready to tackle the challenges head on. For Monocle in San Francisco, I'm Carlota Rebelo. And that's all for this episode of The Urbanist. A special thanks to my guest this week and also to the team at the World Economic Forum. The Urbanist is produced by myself and by David Stevens. This episode was edited by Jack Dewars. I'm Carlota Rebelo. Goodbye and thank you for listening, City Lovers.